The moment my manager called me into his office and I saw the man from the diner sitting behind the desk in a charcoal suit with a visitor badge clipped to his lapel, my first thought was that I had walked into the wrong room. I actually looked back at the door to check the number. I had not walked into the wrong room. The man looked at me the same way he had looked at me 3 weeks earlier. Calm, unhurried, like he had all the time in the world and was choosing to spend it watching me figure things out. He had the same reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, the same slight tilt of the head. The only difference was that this time, he was sitting in my manager's chair and my manager was standing off to the side looking like he wasn't sure what to do with his hands. I should back up. I work at Mercy Ridge Medical Center in Raleigh, have for about 4 years now, since I finished my nursing degree at NC State and passed my boards on the second try. I work the cardiac step-down unit, which is not the ICU, and not the general floor. It's the in-between place, where patients go when they're stable enough to leave intensive care, but still need close enough monitoring that they can't just be left alone. It's a good unit. The nurses on my floor are some of the sharpest people I know. And the work matters in a way that's hard to explain to people who haven't done it. The less good part was my charge nurse supervisor, a man I'll call my supervisor, because calling him anything else right now feels more generous than he deserves. He had been in the role for about 2 years when I first started noticing the pattern. Small things at first. Assignments that always seemed to land heavier on the newer nurses. Schedules adjusted without explanation. If you pushed back on anything, even politely, even with documentation, something would shift in the way he looked at you, and you'd find your next 3 weeks scheduled for the overnight float, covering whatever unit was short-staffed regardless of your specialty. I had learned not to push back. I want to be clear that I am not someone who needs to be told twice. I grew up in a house where you learned fast that making yourself small was sometimes the smartest thing you could do. My mom worked double shifts at a nursing home for most of my childhood, and she used to say that you pick your battles not because you're weak, but because you're strategic. I thought I understood what she meant. I thought I was being strategic. The morning everything changed started the way most of my mornings do, which is to say, chaotically, and on too little sleep. I'd gotten off a 12-hour shift at 7 in the morning, slept 4 hours, and then could not fall back asleep because my upstairs neighbor had apparently decided to rearrange furniture. By 10:30, I was sitting up in bed staring at the ceiling. By 11, I was in my car. There's a diner about 6 minutes from my apartment called Patterson's. It's the kind of place that has been in that spot so long it feels like it predates the surrounding neighborhood. Red vinyl booths, a counter with spinning stools, a pie case by the register that's always half empty by noon. I go there maybe once a week when I'm off. The coffee is not remarkable, but it's hot and it comes fast, and the booths are big enough that you can sit sideways with your legs up and nobody bothers you. I got there around 11:15 and took my usual booth in the back corner. The place was quiet. A couple of guys in construction gear at the counter, a young woman working on a laptop by the window, and one other person, an older man sitting alone at the booth closest to the register. He had to be in his late 60s, maybe early 70s. White hair, closely cropped, straight-backed the way some older people are straight-backed, like it was something that had been trained into them a long time ago and never left. He was wearing a plain navy cardigan and reading a newspaper, an actual physical newspaper, folded to the crossword. He had half a cup of coffee and a plate with the remnants of what looked like it had been a Denver omelet. I didn't pay him any particular attention. I ordered my usual coffee, scrambled eggs, wheat toast, and opened my phone to read through the group chat with the nurses from my floor, which was mostly complaints about the new charting system and a debate about whether anyone was actually going to show up to the optional team breakfast on Saturday. I responded to 2 messages, turned my phone face down, and looked out the window. That's when I heard it. The cashier at the register, a teenager, couldn't have been older than 17. The kind of teenager who looks genuinely distressed when anything goes sideways, was saying something in a low voice to the older man. I couldn't make out the words, but I could read the situation from across the room. The man's card had been declined. I knew that look. The stillness that comes over a person when something embarrassing happens in public and they are trying to hold themselves together while they figure out what to do. He was checking his wallet. He had another card. That card was also declined. He pulled out his phone, I assumed to check his bank account or call someone, and I watched his face do the thing faces do when whatever you see on the screen is not what you hope to see. The cashier, to her credit, was being kind about it. She wasn't making a scene. But the man at the register was quiet in a way that was more than just quiet. He was embarrassed. Genuinely, deeply embarrassed. And there was something about the particular quality of that embarrassment, the way he kept his chin up even while his hands were moving carefully through his wallet for a third time, that got to me in a way I didn't fully expect. I flagged down the waitress, who had just brought my coffee. "Excuse me," I said. "Can I take care of his check? Whatever he had." She looked at me, then at him, then back at me. "Sure, honey. You want me to just add it to yours? Please. And don't tell him which table it came from." She gave me a small nod, like this was not the first time she'd been asked to do exactly that, which made me feel better about the whole thing for reasons I couldn't quite explain. I went back to my eggs. I watched from the corner of my eye as the cashier said something to the man. He frowned, not in a bad way, but in the way people frown when they're confused. He looked around the diner. I was already looking at my phone. After a moment, he picked up his newspaper, folded it under his arm, and walked out. That was it. I didn't think about it much after that. I finished my breakfast, left a decent tip, drove home, and slept for 6 hours straight. I told exactly one person, my coworker, Simone, who I had been friends with since orientation. Simone is the kind of person who responds to most things with a raised eyebrow and a very dry, And her response to my diner story was precisely that, "You're a good person. Now tell me if you're taking the Saturday breakfast because I am not going alone." I was not taking the Saturday breakfast, but I let her guilt me into it anyway. The following 2 weeks at work were fine, then not fine, then actively bad in the way that things at my job sometimes got actively bad. The not fine part started on a Tuesday. I had put in a request 3 weeks earlier to switch one shift with a colleague, a straightforward swap that we had both agreed to and documented properly. My supervisor rejected it without explanation. When I emailed to ask why, he responded 2 days later with a one-line reply that said the schedule had already been finalized. The schedule had not been finalized when I submitted the request. I had the timestamps to prove it. I didn't say that. I said, "Understood, thank you for getting back to me," and I went back to work. The actively bad part started the following Monday. I had a patient, I'll call him my patient because I'm not going to use his name, who had come in for an ablation procedure and was recovering on our unit. He was 63, recently retired, kind of man who apologized every time he pressed the call button, even though that is literally what the call button is for. His daughter had driven 3 hours to be there, and she spent most of the first day sitting in the corner of his room knitting and answering emails on her laptop, with the focus of someone trying very hard not to think about the fact that her father had just had a procedure done on his heart. He was doing fine, his rhythm was stable, his vitals were good, and by day 2, he was sitting up and asking when he could have real food instead of whatever we kept bringing him on the tray. Good sign. I liked him. I told his daughter he was doing well. She cried a little bit in the hallway. The kind of crying that happens when you've been holding yourself together for a long time and someone says the words you needed to hear. On day 3, something flagged on his monitor. Not a crisis. A variation in his rhythm that I wanted the attending to look at before we moved to the next phase of his discharge plan. I pulled up his chart, made a note, and put in the page. My supervisor came to find me before the attending called back. He wanted to know why I had flagged the chart. I explained. He told me I was over-documenting. I said I'd rather over-document than miss something. He said, and I want to get this exactly right because I have thought about it many times since. He said, "You're making the unit look reactive. If you flag everything, administration starts asking questions about our processes." I stood there for a second. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, which was a very specific combination of disbelief and the particular exhaustion that comes from having a conversation like this in a job where the stakes are actual human lives. I said, "He's my patient." I flagged something I thought was worth flagging. He told me to remove the note and resubmit the chart without it. I did not remove the note. The attending called back 20 minutes later, reviewed the flag, and ended up extending my patient's stay by 24 hours for observation. The right call. Exactly the right call. My patient went home the next day without incident, and his daughter stopped me in the hallway and hugged me, which is not something I usually allow, but I was too tired to sidestep. That evening, I got an email from my supervisor informing me that I had been formally written up for insubordination and failure to follow unit protocol. It was copied to the unit director and to HR. I sat in my car in the parking garage for about 15 minutes after I read it. I wasn't crying. I wasn't even really upset yet, because upset requires a kind of energy I didn't have at the end of a 12-hour shift. I was just sitting there, looking at my phone, thinking, okay, so this is what it comes to. Simone texted while I was sitting there, just a question mark because she had heard. I typed back, I'm fine, and then deleted it and typed, I don't know yet, and sent that instead. I drove home. I made pasta. I went to bed. The next morning, I got a call from the hospital's main HR line asking me to come in for a meeting the following Thursday, not my unit's HR contact. The main office. I didn't know what that meant. I told myself it was probably routine, that these things follow a process, that I had documentation of everything. I also knew that documentation doesn't always matter as much as it should, and that my supervisor had been there for 11 years, and I had been there for 4. And that in most organizations, those numbers are the ones that count. I went to work. I took care of my patients. I did not remove any notes from any charts. Thursday came. I got to the administrative building 10 minutes early, sat in the waiting area outside the HR suite, and stared at a motivational poster on the wall that said something about teamwork and excellence. I had my documentation folder in my bag, printed copies of the shift swap request with timestamps, the flagged chart with the attending's response, the email chain. I had been prepared for a lot of different versions of this meeting. I had not been prepared for what I actually found. The HR coordinator came out and walked me to a conference room. I expected the unit director. I expected my supervisor. I expected the particular uncomfortable energy of a meeting that has already been decided before you walk in. What I did not expect was the man from the diner. He was sitting at the far end of the conference table. Same posture. Different clothing. A very good suit this time, no question about that, and a lanyard with his photo and a title I couldn't read from the doorway. Next to him sat a woman with a legal pad, who I would later learn was from the hospital system's regional compliance office. My supervisor was also in the room. He was sitting to the left of the door. He was not making eye contact with anyone. The HR coordinator gestured to a chair across from the compliance officer. I sat down. The man from the diner looked at me for a moment with that same unhurried quality, like he was reading something. Then he said, I'm going to ask you to do something that might feel a little strange. I'd like you to just walk me through the last 3 weeks. So I did. I had not planned to tell the whole story. I had planned to be professional and careful and present my documentation in an organized way. Instead, I talked for about 20 minutes. I talked about the shift swap and the one-line response. I talked about my patient and the chart flag and what the attending had said. I talked about the write-up. I laid the folder on the table and pushed it toward the compliance officer. I did not raise my voice. I did not editorialize. I just told it straight, the way my mother always told me to tell it, when something really mattered. Plain and clear, like you're describing what you saw and not what you felt about what you saw, because what you saw is enough. When I finished, the room was quiet for a moment. My supervisor started to say something. The man from the diner held up one hand, just slightly, just enough, and my supervisor stopped. He looked at the compliance officer. She made a note. Then he looked back at me and said, the documentation you flagged saved your patient from being discharged with an unresolved rhythm, irregularity. The attending confirmed that. I nodded. You were written up for doing your job correctly, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, I said. He nodded slowly. Then he opened the folder and looked through it without hurrying. The same way he had looked at his crossword puzzle that morning in the diner. Careful, thorough, like the answer was in there somewhere and he was going to find it. I found out later who he was. The woman from compliance told me before I left, in the hallway, in a quiet, matter-of-fact way. He was the chief operating officer of the entire regional health network, 7 hospitals, including ours. He had been doing what he apparently did twice a year, which was visit units and departments, without announcement, sit in on processes, talk to staff, see how things actually worked, as opposed to how they looked on paper. The day I had seen him in the diner, he had just come from a full day at our sister hospital in Durham. He had been in back-to-back meetings for 9 hours. His wallet had been sitting in his desk drawer at home since the previous Friday because he had switched bags for a conference and forgotten to transfer it. The card he had tried at the diner was an expired one he'd found at the bottom of his jacket pocket. He had been embarrassed, he told the compliance officer, in the particular way that embarrassing things land harder when you're already tired, and when a young woman quietly paid for his breakfast without making any kind of thing about it. He had thought about it for the rest of that day. When he had walked into our unit 3 weeks later and started talking to staff, and my name had come up, first from one of the overnight nurses, then from Simone, then from the patient whose daughter had cried in the hallway, he had recognized the name from the receipt the cashier had shown him at the diner. He said, when I asked him about it later, that it probably would have gotten to where it got anyway. The pattern in my unit had already flagged during the compliance review. My write-up had accelerated it. I don't know if that's true. I know that the write-up was expunged. I know that my supervisor left the unit within the month, transferred to an administrative role on the other side of the building, which is the hospital equivalent of being moved somewhere you can't do much damage. I know that I was offered a charge nurse development track, which I thought about for 2 weeks and then accepted. I know that I went back to Patterson's the following Saturday morning and sat in my usual booth and ordered my usual eggs and drank coffee. That is still not remarkable, but is still hot and still comes fast. I didn't see the man from the diner. I hadn't expected to. I had a gift card in my bag, a small one, for the diner, in a plain envelope with nothing written on it. I left it on the counter on my way out and told the cashier it was for whoever needed it. She looked at me like she wasn't sure what to do with it. Just whenever, I said. Whoever needs it. She nodded and put it in the register drawer, and I walked out into the November morning, and the air was cold and bright in the way that Raleigh air sometimes gets in November. And I thought about my mother, who had worked double shifts for most of my childhood and told me to pick your battles because you're strategic, not because you're weak. I think she was right about that. I think the thing she didn't say, because maybe she didn't need to, or maybe she just figured I'd have to learn it myself, is that sometimes the battle picks you, and all you can do is make sure you've been doing the right thing all along so that when the moment comes, there's nothing to defend, just the plain, clear truth of what you did and why. Simone texted me while I was in my car in the diner parking lot, the way she always seems to text me when I'm sitting in parking lots. You okay? I typed back, yeah, I'm okay. I meant it this time. I keep thinking about the order of things. Not in a mystical way. I'm not someone who believes the universe is keeping score on a spreadsheet somewhere. But I do think about cause and effect, about how one small choice, made quietly and without expectation, set off a chain of events I never could have mapped out if I'd tried. I paid for a stranger's breakfast. That's all I did. It cost me $11 and change, and I did it because I recognized the look on his face, that particular stillness of someone holding themselves together in public. And I couldn't not do something about it. I didn't do it to be seen. I didn't do it because I thought it would matter beyond that morning. I did it because it was the right thing to do, and that was the whole of my reasoning. That's the part I come back to most, not the outcome. Not the write-up being expunged, or the development track, or any of the things that came after. The part I come back to is the fact that I had no angle. There was nothing strategic about it. I just saw something and responded to it honestly, and then I went back to my eggs and my phone and my life. I think that's what integrity actually looks like when you strip away all the noise around the word. It's not a grand gesture. It's $11 and a quiet word to a waitress. It's flagging a chart because your patient's rhythm looks off, and you'd rather be wrong and document it than be right and say nothing. It's sending an email that says, I don't know yet, instead of I'm fine, when you genuinely don't know yet. The hard part, the part nobody really prepares you for, is doing those things when there's a cost attached. Paying for a stranger's meal is easy when nothing is on the line. Refusing to remove the clinical note is something else when your supervisor is standing in front of you and 11 years of institutional weight is behind him. That's where character actually gets tested. Not in the comfortable moments, but in the ones where the right thing and the easy thing are pointing in completely different directions. I think about my mother a lot when I think about those moments. She didn't have a framework for it. She just worked. She made the call that needed to be made, and then she went back to work and made the next one. What I understand now, that I maybe didn't fully understand before, is that she was also building something. Every time she held the line when it would have been easier not to, she was building the kind of record that speaks for itself when the moment comes. Not a resume, not a reputation, exactly. Just a pattern of choices that, taken together, tell the truth about who you are. The man from the diner didn't save me because I paid for his breakfast. That's not how it worked. He recognized my name because of a small kindness, and then he went looking, and what he found, the charting, the documentation, the nurses who mentioned me, was already there. I had laid it down, one shift at a time, without knowing anyone was looking. That's the thing about doing the work the right way. You don't always know when it's going to matter. You just have to trust that it will, and keep doing it anyway, and be the kind of person who would have done it the same way even if nobody ever found out. Simone would tell me I'm overthinking this. She would raise one eyebrow and say, and change the subject to whether I'm going to the Saturday breakfast. She's probably right, but I think some things are worth sitting with for a while.